Question 6 of the Russia questions, and after this you're halfway done. So, were Lenin's economic policies a success? That's the question. So in considering this question, they might ask you it in two parts. They might ask you, was war communism a success, which was Lenin's first economic policy? They might ask you, was the NEP a success, a new economic policy, which was Lenin's second economic policy? Or they might just ask you, were Lenin's economic policies a success, which would encourage you to talk about both. So Lenin had two economic policies. The first was war communism, and that lasted from 1918 to 1921. And war communism was when the communists took over the factories and introduced forced requisition of grain. So the checker would go around and collect all the agricultural produce of the farmers, and then they would redistribute these in a way to help them win the Civil War. Anyone who complained about it was labelled as not a true communist, a kulak, which was like a rich peasant, and punished very harshly. The second economic policy was introduced in 1921, when actually by this point Russia's economy was on the verge of absolute collapse agriculturally. And the NEP lasted from 1921 until 1928. So this was the reintroduction of capitalism. So small factories were privatised again. In war communism, they were taken over by the Bolsheviks. Now, private owners could have any factory that employed less than 20 people. And most importantly, farmers were allowed to sell goods above a set quota. So they were given a quota, they had to produce a certain amount, and anything they produced in excess of that amount, they could sell. Small businessmen, because of the NEP, were created, and they were known as netmen. So it was almost a turnaround. They were reversing some of war communism, but not all of it. So let's have a look at whether these policies were a success. So war communism successes. Firstly, it was very aligned to the communist philosophy of more equality. There was state ownership, and there was no ability for private sales, so for some people to be richer than others. So in that sense, it fitted the ideology of communism. It gave Lenin a lot of power. The Supreme Economic Council, known as the Vysenka, sorry, there should be no N in that, it should be V-E-S-E-N-K-A, the Vysenka, were now in control of the Russian economy. The biggest success was definitely that they were able to feed the Red Army, they were able to arm the Red Army in a way the Tsar hadn't been able to in World War I, and therefore were able to win the Civil War. This was because the grain requisitioned from the farmers was redistributed and more proportionally was given to the army. Furthermore, the factories, now under state control, were very strictly disciplined. Strikes were not allowed, for example, which meant that there was greater production of armaments in particular. So the failures of war communism. It was incredibly unpopular, with peasants who didn't want to give away the surplus of their grain, and with workers who didn't enjoy the stricter discipline. The workers even convinced the Kronstadt sailors, who had helped the Bolsheviks during the October Revolution, to mutiny, because they were so upset about the conditions in which they were being forced to work, the long working hours, and the famines happening in the countryside. Indeed, the output, especially agriculturally, reduced as a result of war communism, because peasants didn't understand why they should bother growing so much if it was just going to be taken away from them. And sometimes they even hoarded their own grain or tried to destroy excess grain in protest. And this led to wide-scale famine. And by 1921, if Lenin didn't change his economic policy, the agricultural basis of Russia would have collapsed. The crisis was that extreme. But he did. And the introduction of a new economic policy really shows you the limitations of war communism. If it was going well, why would he have needed a new economic policy? The new economic policy, the NEP, did have a number of successes. It was a lot more popular. Peasants enjoyed being able to sell surplus grain. Factory owners enjoyed getting their factories back as long as they employed less than 20 workers. And production rose. Agricultural and industrial output increased, and the famine, that was seen over here, ended. They were able to electrify Russia, introducing power across the country. And Lenin, whilst not having as much control as under war communism, still had a great deal of control. The Vysenka still could set quotas, they still taxed surplus grain. All big factories that employed more than 20 people were still state-controlled and state-owned. So they still had a great deal of power. What were the negatives? What were the failures? So it wasn't aligned, the NEP wasn't aligned to communism. It in fact introduced more of a capitalist philosophy, and they reintroduced the ruble, the Russian currency. Indeed, 25,000 netmen, which are small businessmen, were created in Moscow alone. So that did show almost a hierarchy economically being developed in society again, and there were more richer peasants who became known as kulaks. The fact that the NEP wasn't aligned to communism led to criticism of Lenin amongst the Bolsheviks, and one of these critics of the NEP was Trotsky. Also, the economy still remained backwards. Agriculturally, they were still using hand tools and sometimes strip farming. Industrially, the factories were still backwards. They weren't competing with the developed world. And because of the reintroduction of the currency and people making more money, there was a rise of crime, gambling and prostitution, which were seen as the vices of capitalism within Russia. So that is the successes of Lenin's economic policies. You can see it as a revision card here with pictures of the power war communism gave to the Red Army, the starvation that resulted from war communism, the increased capitalism and netmen of the NEP, and the remaining backwards nature of farming. Remember to memorise this. You need to almost talk through the pictures yourself and see if you can verbalise the answer to the question. Then turn so you can't see your original kind of dual coding device and try to draw it from memory. This obviously doesn't have to be neat in any way. You'll just be chucking it away afterwards. It's just so you can see which bits you can remember and which bits you can't. And then try to revisit it regularly. And that is the end of our 6th question, and we are at our halfway point.